I think the weirdest quirk of Overwatch is that the most important and defining feature of the game is possibly the least noticeable and innocent factor possible. It genuinely could have been one of the most costly blunders ever in the design of the game. Blizzard seems to agree because they've implemented what is most likely the biggest overhaul in the history of Overwatch, and at least half of the changes appear to have been made specifically to tackle this one issue. There's a popular phrase in the community that's really relevant here. Overwatch is the hardest game to aim in, but it's a game where aim matters the least. It's very simply acceleration. We're not talking about movement abilities or buttons here, we're talking about the bedrock. Changing from left to right happens almost instantly in Overwatch, and I can't overstate this is incredibly rare in FPS games. And ripples from this one seemingly completely benign decision have continued through the game all the way up until today. The way most games work is they have a ramping climb to max speed after changing directions, but some games have a massive slowdown on shooting which locks you into fights. Some games have momentum-based systems like bunny hopping, where changing direction is almost never a good idea. Weirdly enough, Overwatch is one of the only games with an almost perfect snap. In all of these cases, however, the movement plays a major part in defining the game genre and feel. There's not been a single mention I can find in the entire internet all the way back to the game's launch where the team discusses this, until last week. Before now, I didn't even think it might have been on their radar, but this may be the most positive change ever for the game. So why is this system good? Why is it bad? What problems has it caused? Why do we even have it in the first place? And how has Blizzard fixed it? If you've ever given a game to a parent before, you know that some people who've never picked up a controller can be excluded from playing a game simply because they couldn't stop looking at the roof or the floor. There is a low level of base competency one has to reach in order to play any game, and this is normally the level where you can use the control scheme to the point where you won't be simply just frustrated by it and self-select yourself out of the user base by finding something else to do. This skill floor comes coupled with a skill ceiling, which is the maximum skill expression which still nets you a reward once you've mastered the system in question. In most cases, when making a product, you generally want to present your product with the skill floor side up to the customer, because it helps tremendously with people's willingness to accept to onboard the product. And you want to really conceal or just imply a little bit about the skill ceiling, so that while the more invested customers can discover the depth to your product later, you don't raise the implied skill ceiling to the point where people choose not to interact with the product. Fortnite, for example, is a prime example of perceived and actual skill floor being slowly raised over time by people's adoption and perfection of building mechanics. Come to think of it, where the hell are all these video essays that should be making bank out of talking about this? Like, someone really should get on this. Despite it being only a small part of the puzzle, Overwatch's movement system being designed around almost instant acceleration really helped to present side up to the customer a low flawed, easy to understand system, and really helped the onboarding into the game of non-FPS players. On the game's release, the media and general community reacted massively positively to this movement system, and it creates an incredibly tight feeling, with like instant feedback from every button press and responsive and satisfying movement. It just kind of feels good to exist in Overwatch. In addition, because of the high acceleration, AD spamming or general movement tech and hitbox manipulation is incredibly common as a strategy to increase survivability. An AD strafing tracer, for example, has a certain cadence to get from the left to right strafing animation, where her head hitbox will have the largest amount of movement. But this is a predictable movement pattern, so as you get better, you have to mix up with short strafes, long strafes, crouches and pauses. Even in the simplest case, small adjustments and constant random movements, instead of being stationary, really up your survivability. Despite it being really concealed from direct view of the customer, learning movement tech is a really long-term engaging skill to learn. It really heightens the skill ceiling of Overwatch. All of this is obviously an almost perfect example of good design and marketing. Right? Okay, so here's the rub. With every silver lining comes some sort of cloud. And movement mechanics are intimately intertwined with the other side of the coin. Okay, the AD strafing person themselves has to constantly correct their aim to be back over their target when they change direction. This is fine, like unless you're spamming your keys, you can pretty much learn to correct for your own movement. But the moment you think about, I guess, clicking on the tracer, you kind of see the complexity emerge. And now just imagine yourself in a like tracer versus tracer duel, and you need to dodge as well. Yeah. Learning to aim in Overwatch consists of more than one skill. You not only need to click accurately on the spot, but learn to predict your opponent's strafing patterns, and learn to correct your own aiming patterns from your own movement. As well as that, if every character has to go from moving left to right in a single frame or two, the character animations need to flow seamlessly between these poses. Despite the animators doing everything they can to keep the game readable and clear for a viewer, this creates a lot of visual jank. In reality, the animation will only ever be able to do so much to keep up with the direction changes. If you've ever wondered why watching competitive Overwatch feels so messy and hard to follow, this is a really big reason that's honestly never spoke about. One example I use to explain the work the animations are doing and the muscle memory required to play the game is as follows. When a Zen and an Ashe crouches, which one's head moves more? If you know the answer to this, you have way too much ingrained knowledge about the animations in Overwatch. And I'm really going to bet that a large majority of this video's viewers actually know the answer. It's Zenyatta, by the way. This really is unique and sets Overwatch apart from most other games and isn't really understood even by the hardcore player base. For instance, when Valorant came out, there were so many articles and so many players somehow comparing this new tactical shooter game with Overwatch because both games had abilities and ultimates, I guess. In reality, when we put the games side by side, you can see the difference instantly. Valorant requires you to lock your movement when shooting for accuracy, meaning that the fights are much more about precise aiming, crosshair positioning, reaction time, and tracking consistent movement patterns, whereas Overwatch requires, well, everything. Accuracy, precision, reaction, tracking, prediction, the list kind of keeps on going. If you just take the simple concept of tracking another character on, let's say, Soldier, and that person isn't interested in getting shot, the skill required are not only FPS mechanics, but on top of that, very similar to fighting games in the level of prediction needed. In high-level games, players literally are learning on the fly others' strafing patterns in order to correct for them and catch them out. I mean, look at this top 500 player literally shooting the ground with a helix rocket, which is, by the way, quite a big projectile because it's just too hard to hit a Kiriko in front of them with a direct hit. This is so far beyond what any other game on the market demands, it's insane. At this point, you may be thinking something along the lines of like, yeah, sure, CS and Valorant obviously have more simple movement systems to concentrate on precise gunplay, blah, 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 blah. I bet this isn't uncommon for FPS to use this system. So let's just check off some games. Halo, Call of Duty, Quake, Apex, Fortnite, Tarkov, Titanfall, Paladins, Destiny, Battlefield, Splitgate, Insurgency? No? TF2 is the final game you might think would have almost instant acceleration, being the game Overwatch took direct inspiration from, but even here it's slower, and this small difference massively influences the gameplay and game feel. The actual games where the system exists in reality are things like Quake, Doom, and Siege. In general, arena shooters and incredibly hardcore experiences whose target audiences are the top 5% of FPS players. In looking into Jeff Kaplan and many of the other teams' prior FPS experience, we find exactly that. Quake, Doom, and Half-Life 1, and we also find very little FPS systems development experience across the board. Blizzard's style of development has always been to renovate and convert a previously undeveloped genre into a cash cow by giving the games a smoother learning curve, beautiful art styles which hold up for years, and pumping a hell of a lot of money into marketing. At this point, you might want to have a think about Blizzard's current installed player base in 2016. The games they currently have out are World of Warcraft, StarCraft, Heart of the Swarm, Hearthstone, and Diablo. Most of these players from different genres tried Overwatch, didn't click with it, and assumed that it was because they don't like FPS games. For some of them, obviously this is true, but we need to ask ourselves exactly how many of these players could have stayed within the system and actually paid money into Blizzard, but were turned off not by the fact that it's an FPS game, but by the fact that it's a harder FPS game than almost anything else on the market. This is even more important nowadays because the majority of Overwatch 2's player base is on console, and you have a massive pool of Switch players who literally are playing at 16 FPS. How low should the bar to entry be? Should a parent, a Switch player, or for instance a World of Warcraft player be able to interact with this game if they have basic competency with the control scheme? This is the trade-off. How low should the bar be set? The natural response this discussion receives is that Overwatch is uniquely accommodating to the unskilled player base because there's alternative characters that don't even demand that you ever interact with the aiming system. Mercy is one of the most one-trick heroes in the game, and this is a large part of the reason. But there's a fine line between allowing players to choose to interact with the aiming system if they want to, and forcing players into a self-quarantine from the FPS elements due to the massive task in onboarding. If a Switch player picks up the game and happens to luck into or look up a low aiming skill character, and so can interact with the systems, they are basically forced to only use this small subset of characters in perpetuity until they learn to use the controls. And just quarantining players hasn't been a smooth solution, even in the limited way that it succeeds, because Blizzard have always struggled to balance characters with a low aiming skill floor. A couple of characters like Moira and Lifeweaver have pretty much no skill ceiling because they've been given no way to control the game, and are hated in low ranks because, in the absence of being given other strengths, they've just been made impossible to kill. A couple of characters like Torbjorn and Symmetra have been reworked, and now all the players who want to use these characters as safe havens to avoid the hard as nails aiming system have been outright left out to dry. At this point, the DPS category simply just has no I don't want to click on things heroes. A couple of characters as well, like Winston, Brig and Diva, have specifically been noob trapped since the game's launch, because they present towards the consumer as easy to pick up and learn in hero design and gameplay loop, but they have such a massively hard positioning requirement that they actually present a concealed massive game sense skill in onboarding. There's really no questioning it. It's become a lot harder to exist inside Overwatch without clicking on things. And when I come home from a 10-hour day at work, I don't necessarily want to have to compete in aiming skill against teenagers who play every day without fail whilst hyped up on vape pens and glue. The good news is that Blizzard has clearly always been in some way aware of this problem with onboarding into the aiming system, and have done their best to reduce aiming skill whilst keeping their movement system. TF2 already had hitboxes inflated larger than their characters to account for the much slower movement acceleration, but Overwatch took this concept to the next level. The hitboxes on their characters since launch have been basically Michelin men, and many of the projectiles have also been larger than they appear. The weirdest thing that I find though is that before now there hasn't been a single reference I can find to this difficulty in onboarding being due to anything other than the actual movement ability buttons making the game hectic. So color me really like surprised and happy when this bad boy turns up in the development notes. Maybe after all this time, they've realized? But there's a really big problem here for Blizzard. Like, what do you do if you realize the fundamentals of the game feel fundamentally are just intimately tied to making the game inaccessible to the primary target audience? I think the only real answer here is the cat's out of the bag in terms of changing it. 99% of players couldn't even pinpoint the acceleration as a factor if you put a gun to their head. So if Blizzard wanted to decrease the acceleration at all, it wouldn't be possible without massive uproar and confusion. So the only other thing they can do is what they've done: unilateral projectile size increases. I think this is genuinely the most forward-thinking move the development team has ever made to the core gameplay of Overwatch, and this might be the only way they can fix an issue baked into the game at the point of conception 7 years ago. But with every silver lining, yeah. You know when everyone called Hanzo's arrows logs? Like, they still do it, and it's been 4 years since they've been changed? 5 years? It's gotta be like 5 years. They weren't even that large beforehand. Hitbox sizes are another thing entwined with another system, and despite how positive this change may be, I'm worried. Unfortunately, the other system here is, well, another one Switch players already really struggle against. It's lag compensation. Overwatch naturally favors the shooter, as any FPS game should, so if they hit on their screen, they get the kill. This obviously affects console users and therefore Wi-Fi users a lot more. If two hitboxes come into contact with each other, the bullet hits. So the effect is to essentially draw another bubble around the Michelin Man the distance away of the radius of the projectile size. Overwatch hitboxes were already very damn large, and they're becoming even larger. So on top of dealing with lag compensation making it feel as if you're being hit around corners, you're gonna be actually hit around corners. Maybe the Hanzo log arrow was really impactful in the mind of players because it was a ranged instant kill. I don't know where this one will land, and this is one problem I can't blame the current devs for. They're just trying to fix what is probably a mistake made 7 years ago. Will the downside outweigh the upside here? Will the game be in a better state? I guess we gotta wait for time to tell. Comment below on what you think the outcome's gonna be, because I'm pretty much at a loss here. If you got this far, check out my Life Weaver Malga videos, or pop into my Twitch. I stream every weekend doing coaching and VOD reviews. If you want any coaching, my rates and rules are in the Discord. Thank you for listening.